then now let's move to the next speaker, Professor Georg Moeller from University of Macau. The title is Minimalist Amorality, a Contemporary Taoist Perspective.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join this conference, which turns out to be very interesting. I'm trying to share my screen. Let me see. Can you see the screen and does it move?
No problem. Yeah.
Okay, good. So as you can see, the title is Minimalist Amorality, Contemporary Taoist Perspective. Let me start with a quote here from a CNN article, which was published at the beginning of the Ukraine war. The war, just a few weeks into the war. And this article entitled, "What Could Stop the War?" ended with these words: "The morality is black and white here, but diplomacy seldom is. The concessions that come with negotiations are often painful." So already at the beginning of the war, even CNN, which has a very strong moralist position on the war, and sees the morality as black and white, pointed out that in order to actually somehow resolve the conflict, negotiations or mediations are necessary, and that in order to mediate, probably they only talk about basically the Ukraine or the Western side, but basically both sides will have to, I guess, suspend morality, suspend the insistence on rightness, in order to come to a solution and an end of the conflict. And this notion of suspension of morality was also already expressed by Professor Liu earlier, if I didn't misunderstand him. So that's basically what I am arguing here for in this paper, that instead of aiming at some sort of minimal consensus in order to solve crisis, what is actually needed is a form of suspension of morality, so some form of minimalist amorality instead of a minimalist morality. And thereby I'm basically challenging a premise that was made in the conference outline, which states that a shared and practicable morality is sorely needed at a planetary scale to cope with apocalyptic times in which the pandemic is ravaging humanity and extreme weather events have become the new normal. And now we have actually a hot war and a cold war. In addition to that, that's may turn into a hot war anytime soon. So the challenge to this presumption is, I think, is such a shared, even minimalist morality at a planetary scale possible or realistic? And I think so far we've never reached it. And if we're in urgent need, then I think it's even less realistic to expect that such a shared morality will be practicable. And then secondly, is morality at all necessary or effective in dealing with major and present crises such as war, climate, and pandemic? Is this really a good way of approaching such problems? And so the question is basically, is a minimal amorality perhaps more realistic and effective? Is there maybe something wrong with the assumption that morality is all that helpful? So in order to address these questions, I want to talk about morality and what I like to call social differentiation. So from my perspective, morality is first and foremost, from an empirical, practical perspective, a highly effective type of communication, right? I mean, we are also communicating morally right now here in this conference, but probably much more importantly, it's also a type of communication that's constantly employed in politics, in media as well, not just in academics. And typically, just like in this conference, also in politics and in media, it's used to distinguish oneself or to distinguish one side from another side, right? Political candidates outline their respective moral superiority, for instance, in election campaigns, but even in places like China, where you don't necessarily have general elections, still moral communication is used in order to distinguish your political position or your political status from potentially opposing ones. So similar like to this, also as to distinguish ourselves as philosophers, we try our best in this conference to outline the relative superiority of our moral philosophies. So while, of course, there is some room for consensus, it is an important function of morality to bring about some sort of consensus. Consensus doesn't make the difference, right? So there's always the difference that is built into the consensus. We always have a consensus against another position that we clearly perceive and that we clearly describe, be it in politics, be it in the media, be it in academics. So consensus can never be full consensus as long as we're operating in the sphere of morality. There is always consensus as opposed to that which we are, what we are defining, understanding, describing as morally bad or morally lacking or morally evil. So in each peculiar social context, moral communication is effectively applied as a mark of distinction, is subject to the respective systemic specific communicative frameworks, politics, media, academic, and so forth. So therefore, I guess the hope that somehow more and more, or just better moral communication leads to consensus at the expense of dissent seems illusory to me. Instead, I think that we should look at the possibility of a minimalist amorality. And I do think that such progress to amorality has already been made in several social systems, not so much in academia, I'm afraid, and not so much in politics. But if we look towards other social spheres, for instance, medicine, I think we've made some amoral progress. For instance, with regard to alcoholism, to just give one example, like basically in many traditions, specifically in the Christianity influenced American recent tradition, alcoholism was basically regarded for a long time as a moral problem, right? Alcoholics were just bad people. But somehow as sinful, and that's why we had prohibition in America. It's morally suspicious. It's an issue that has to be addressed with morality. But now I think we've learned, at least in many countries, to treat alcoholism not so much as a sin or as a moral problem, but as a problem of addiction. And I think that makes a lot more sense. And similar, to give another example, in law and the legal sphere, traditionally divorce proceedings were basically moral conflicts, right? It was about identifying who is guilty, who cheated, or whatsoever, who was the more immoral person. And in contemporary divorce law in many Western societies, that's no longer the case. Now, also, we no longer treat divorce from a legal perspective as an issue where we have to establish, where we operate primarily with moral criteria. So I think both these are clear cases where we've moved from a minimalist morality, or not so minimalist morality, to a minimalist amorality. And I think that's actually pragmatically useful. So this begs the question, what is morality? And traditional approaches to morality, which are still very strong in academic philosophy, either view morality as like a personal quality, especially in Confucianism, right? In virtue ethics, role ethics, you know, as well, both in virtue ethics and in role ethics, morality is seen to be somehow as, you know, a form of excellence that a person either has or lacks. And then, of course, there's another major view about morality, that's the quality of an act. If you look at utilitarianism or pragmatism, then, you know, we have to not so much reflect on people, on individuals, on character qualities, but on the qualities of actions. And then we make a moral judgment about which action is more and which one is less moral, and then we decide for the one that's more moral. And that basically leads to, I guess, which is now maybe perhaps the most common view among academics, among moral philosophers, that somehow morality is the quality of a maxim, of a moral law, following Kant, right? That we have to identify, and I think Michael Walzer, for instance, is still in this larger category, you know, that we have to get the moral principles right, even if only on a minimal scale. So these are the traditional approaches to morality that you find in philosophy, but I think that's problematic. I think the moral law remains highly elusive, and I'll just skip this here, the final two things on the previous slide, and move to the next slide. I think if we actually look at what morality empirically is, we can make use of alternative philosophical and theoretical resources. So I'm not suggesting that this is a new claim, but perhaps it's a minority claim. Namely that morality is neither something that is rooted in a person, empirically speaking, nor that is rooted in acts, and also not in principles, but that's actually a type of communication. And quote here from Nietzsche's posthumously published fragments, says, "My main proposition," so it's a strong claim, "my main proposition, there are no moral phenomena. There's only a moral interpretation of these phenomena." So morality as a form of interpretation, or in a wider sense, as a form of communication, as a form of basically uttering judgments. And similar, but in a much more theoretically elaborated way, we have the contemporary German social theorist Niklas Luhmann, who says that morality in reality are, and he uses this kind of metaphor here, the conditions on the market of social esteem. So the market of social esteem is what perhaps other philosophers would have called the public sphere. Luhmann doesn't use the term because it's associated with Habermas, his main theoretical opponent. But that's an elaboration basically of Nietzsche's claim that morality is a type of communication that is somehow pervasive in society. And so it's kind of the current interpretations of phenomena, the current moral interpretations of phenomena that are socially available and made available, for instance, through politics or through media. So based on this, I'd like to take a little closer look, try to look more closely at this market of social esteem and at what morality currently actually is. So I think Luhmann is right. It's a discourse that shapes ethical values or ethical value in the singular on various social markets, right? It functions in that way similar to financial value. Comparable to the shaping of economic value in the financial markets. And importantly, these conditions on the moral market, so to speak, are in permanent flux, right? And this is the case, of course, also in the economy. There is no such thing as a stable economic value. And now, you know, also moral values are highly volatile. The communication constantly shifts in one direction and the other. Now we have whatever, a rise of wokeness, as it is sometimes called, which represents a certain kind of a certain kind of shift on the moral market. And at the same time, they're of course incessantly contested, right? So the so-called culture wars that we are witnessing in the West are basically contests about moral value. And in this addition to this, I like to point out that somehow moral profiles, like there's a kind of a moral branding going on, right? Politicians are constantly, for instance, but also academics, in need of embracing and expressing certain moral positions that are rewarded through social validation in the specific spheres where they are competing. And they are tied to their personal profiles. So moral profiles are shaped through constantly, again, highly dynamic social validation feedback loops where we kind of make moral statements and then we test the reaction to it and then kind of alter and react to it. So there's constant feedback loops going on, just as on the financial markets, on the economical market, also on the moral market. It's kind of it's very much a dynamic process that's going on, and it shapes the value not of whatever a brand, but in this kind of, let's say, an academic publication or a political party or a political candidate. And constantly, we are constantly in this discourse where like a vast anonymous actually and virtual audience produce instant reactions to moral performances. So it's a highly volatile moral market that we cannot evade. And importantly, it's subject to what I like to call with Luhmann's second order observation. To understand the moral value of a statement, and importantly, its effect on one's own profile, it's insufficient just to analyze the statement or the performance, right? We can't just analyze the moral value of one of our academic competitors by simply looking at his or her paper and analyzing the validity of his or her argument. We must analyze instead how the statement, the paper, the presentation is observed on the moral marketplace. We must look how it is perceived, how do the others comment on it, right? And that's crucial for understanding the value, the moral value of any given position. So we cannot just observe the position, we must observe how the position is being observed. And then we must be capable of expressing what we observe in order to as an investment in our own moral profile. So this is unavoidable, and yet I think in times in our society, especially in times of crisis, it seems to me crucial to kind of, as I said at the beginning, to suspend moral communication. Right? Morality does shape the identity of individuals or collectives. And it's difficult to imagine a politician, a corporation, or an academic not communicating morally. They might seem to lack a discernible identity, right? So it's basically impossible to get rid of moral communication. That would be also a non-realistic demand. But on the other hand, moral communication is also not a must. In many everyday contexts, there is no need to communicate morally, like a chat with a friend, even when teaching a class or going to a medical examination. We don't really need moral discourse to solve a problem or to just, have an effective social procedure, like, again, having a class or a chat. So I do think amorality can provide relief from moral pressures. It can ease communication among hostile opponents who hold incompatible moral convictions. So if conflicting parties achieve to suspend their moral beliefs and their moral mode of communication, even if only for a while, temporarily, I think common ground outside the moral space may be found. And it seems to me that especially in times of crisis and war, a shared amorality, like something like an agreement to disagree and to not further, discuss the disagreement, seems less difficult to achieve than actually a shared morality. And thus it seems to be, at least to me, a more promising route toward compromise and peace. That's it.
Thank you, Professor Moeller. Okay, now let's open for questions. Anyone will raise your hands. Okay, Professor Shen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Moeller, and a wonderful presentation. And I still some question. And I think what you against is a very strong conception of morality. So in this sense, your minimalist immorality is not against the minimalist morality. So I think what you're against is a strong sense. It's a strong concept of the conception of the morality. And the second question is about. I think maybe the amorality still need some value judgment. Sometimes you say it's a no educational value. So in some sense, it's not a value neutrality. There are still some value oriented. Yeah. So just based on what's your definition of the morality, in some sense, maybe we say it's not a minimalist morality, but it's a minimalist value. So there still need someone to as the bottom line. Yeah. And if we have the immoral attitude, to discuss or to make or to reach compromise, but how this morality to face the power is the restraint of power is also a minimal morality. So how to face the power, the political power? Yeah. So this is my question. Thank you.
Very good questions. Thank you very much. Let me begin with the second question. Yes, of course, it's impossible to and desirable not to have make value judgments. And for instance, the example I gave in the talk, if you're a doctor and someone comes who is an alcoholic, then the first thing you make the value judgment, it's bad that you're an alcoholic, and it would be good if you wouldn't be, right? So, but this is a medical value judgment that is not necessarily at the same time a moral value judgment. And I would say that most of the value judgments that we make in everyday life and that actually make our society function the way it functions are non-moral judgments. And I think I agree there with basically with people like Sam Harris that these are basically considerations of well-being. But I actually strongly disagree with Sam Harris that considerations or values connected to well-being are the same as moral judgments. I think there's a big difference between the two. So again, I think I can say to an alcoholic, it contributes to your health. So that means to your physical well-being if you don't drink. But I completely refrain from judging if drinking is a good or bad act, or even stronger, if drinking makes you a good or bad person individually. And then, so again, I think in this way, and this is the main proposition, I guess, of my talk. That's why that's now responding to the first question that you had. I do think it is very crucial not to make the mistake that Harris, in my view, makes, for instance, to equate well-being or to equate value judgments with moral judgments. I think moral, as I said, morality is, we have to understand this, it is a specific type of communication. And this type of communication, simply put, is very dangerous, much more dangerous than other types of communication. So in that way, I will insist that I'm arguing not for a minimalist morality, but a minimalist amorality, because what I'm asking for is not to eliminate moral communication, but just to at least suspend it, suspend it temporarily, at least in times of crisis, because it's too dangerous. Now, this brings me to the third point, which is a very, very important observation that you make. That's the question of power. And unfortunately, there is a very, very tight relationship between power and morality, because one of the main, if not the main, communicational tools to maintain and justify and legitimate power is moral communication. There is no power that doesn't use moral communication to legitimize itself and to basically be considered as legitimate by those who are subject to this power. So, and that's something that I didn't talk about, but it's you identified a most crucial point here. But again, I think the point, at least from my perspective, is in line with my general hypothesis that morality is first and foremost a type of communication, and it is precisely a type of communication that is connected with the exercise and the maintenance and the legitimization of power.
Thank you.
Some more questions, please. Okay, Professor Li.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And I did find a lot of similarities between your thought and also my thought. And my question would be, it's actually quite direct and also very straightforward, is that how did you imagine or how did you perceive communication under minimalist amorality? Because previously you talked about communication, power, and morality. Then what kind of communication would you consider would be counted as communication under amorality, basically?
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Liu, for the question. It's a very good and important question. And I mean, there are myriad ways of communicating with more or less, or even basically no moral, let's say, that are not highly morally charged, or maybe not morally charged at all. And I think and that's also why I think I look at Taoism, to go back to this topic, and especially at the Zhuangzi, very much as a therapeutic form of philosophy that somehow teaches us how to communicate in a non-moral way. Right. I think one of the diagnoses of the Zhuangzi of Taoism is the harm, the pathology of over-moralized discourse, which it already perceived in early Chinese society, but it's not something that is particularly Chinese. You have it in contemporary America, the moral poison, as much as in early China. But again, I think what Taoism, one way of understanding Taoism, and specifically the Zhuangzi, is as a therapeutic practice of a type of communication that deconstructs moral discourse, right? So it practices non-moral communication, and from judging from your paper earlier, I think you're familiar with this kind of philosophical tradition through actually a method of deconstruction. And much more concretely, I think that the most concrete form of communication that deconstructs morality is humor. And that's, I think, why the Zhuangzi and the Taoism is such a humorous text. Because in humor, humor is based on incongruity, on making incongruity visible, on making ambiguity visible, and kind of it releases, also psychologically speaking, the tension the civilizational tension that is based on always having to make right and wrong distinctions, and specifically moral right and wrong distinction. So humor is I think the most practical everyday form of deconstructing morality that all of us use all the time. That's actually, we don't need to be philosophers in order to do this. Actually, many philosophers are not really that good at it, as many people who are not philosophers. So that would be my answer to your question. I mean, that is for me the kind of the cultural invention that has allowed humans to, at least to a certain extent, to minimize the dangers and the pathologies of moral discourse. So I would, if you ask me about the archetype of amoral communication that is at the same time therapeutically helpful, it's humor. In German, there is a saying, Lachen ist gesund, laughter is healthy, right? Laughter is healthy. And I think that's a very important element, or for me maybe the most important element of humor, and it has the capacity to resolve moral tension and moral fear and moral pathologies.